The cameras were rolling when Scarlett Johansson said the words that would pierce straight through Janet Morrison's heart. The Late Show studio buzzed with its familiar energy. 300 audience members filled every seat, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of stage lights that had witnessed decades of entertainment history. The iconic New York skyline backdrop stretched behind David's desk, Manhattan's towering silhouettes creating a dramatic canvas against the deep blue curtains that had become synonymous with late-night television. Scarlett was leaning back in the guest chair, her blonde hair catching the studio lights as she spoke with the kind of thoughtful honesty that had made her one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. She wore a simple black blazer over a white blouse, her posture relaxed yet attentive, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. The Late Show audience hung on every word, drawn into the intimate conversation about motherhood, career, and finding balance in a world that demanded everything from women. "Being a mom has changed everything for me," Scarlett was saying, her voice carrying a warmth that transcended her on-screen personas. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, the gesture of someone comfortable with vulnerability, someone who had learned that strength and openness weren't mutually exclusive. "Before I had Rose, I thought I understood what strength meant. I thought I knew what it felt like to be vulnerable. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for the moment you realize that your entire heart is walking around outside your body." David Letterman nodded from behind his mahogany desk, his fingers steepled in that familiar pose of thoughtful attention. At 68, he'd interviewed thousands of celebrities, but conversations about parenthood always seemed to reach something deeper, something that connected the famous to the universal human experience. "How do you balance it all?" David asked. "The career, the movies, the travel, and being present for your daughter?" Scarlett smiled, but there was something bittersweet in her expression. "You know, Dave, some days I feel like I'm failing at everything. I'll be on a film set at 5 a.m. thinking about whether Rose had a good breakfast, or I'll be reading her a bedtime story while mentally rehearsing lines for the next day. But then I think about all the young women who watch my movies, who see these characters I play, and I hope that maybe I'm showing them that you can be strong and vulnerable at the same time." In the third row of the studio audience, Janet Morrison felt her breath catch in her throat. She clutched the envelope in her hands tighter, the cream-colored paper soft from being folded and unfolded countless times over the past 2 years. The envelope's edges were worn smooth, the way cherished objects become when they're handled with reverence and desperation in equal measure. Inside that envelope was a letter written in the careful handwriting of a 16-year-old girl who had been fighting for her life. A letter that had never been sent. A letter that was supposed to have been delivered after a recovery that never came. Janet was 58 years old with graying brown hair that she'd stopped dyeing after Sarah died. Vanity had seemed pointless in the face of such profound loss. Her eyes carried the particular sadness of a mother who had outlived her child, a weight that settled into the lines around her mouth and the set of her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress, the same dress she'd worn to Sarah's funeral 2 years ago, and to every significant event since then. Not because she couldn't afford new clothes, but because wearing it made her feel closer to her daughter, made her feel like Sarah was still with her somehow. The dress had been Sarah's choice, actually. "Mom, you look elegant in black," her daughter had said during one of their shopping trips between treatments. Not sad black, but strong black, like you could handle anything. Sarah had always been wise beyond her years, even before the cancer forced her to grow up too quickly. She hadn't planned to be here tonight. When her sister Linda had surprised her with late show tickets for her birthday, Janet's first instinct had been to decline. She'd barely left the house for anything beyond work and grocery shopping since Sarah died. The thought of sitting in an audience pretending to laugh, pretending to enjoy herself, felt impossible. But Linda had insisted. "Sarah would want you to get out," she'd said. "She always loved watching late-night shows with you. Remember how you two would stay up past her bedtime when she was younger, sharing a bowl of ice cream and critiquing the guests?" Janet remembered. Those had been some of the best nights of her life, before the diagnosis, before the hospitals, before everything changed. Sarah had been fascinated by celebrities, not in a starstruck way, but with the curiosity of someone who understood that famous people were just humans playing roles, dealing with the same fears and hopes as everyone else. When the doctors had first told them about Sarah's leukemia, when the treatments began, and the long hospital stays became routine, Sarah had developed a particular attachment to Scarlett Johansson's movies. Not the action films or the dramatic roles that made headlines, but the quieter performances where Scarlett played women dealing with loss, with uncertainty, with the challenge of being strong when everything around them was falling apart. It started accidentally during Sarah's first extended hospital stay. Marriage Story happened to be available. And despite Janet's initial skepticism about a divorce movie for a teenager with cancer, Sarah had insisted. "She gets it, Mom," Sarah had said one evening, during a particularly difficult round of chemotherapy. They were watching the film on Janet's laptop, the small screen propped up on the hospital bed tray table. "She understands what it's like to be brave when you don't feel brave." Janet had watched her daughter's face during that movie, seen how Sarah seemed to draw strength from Scarlett's performance, how she sat up a little straighter during the difficult scenes, how her own tears mirrored those on screen. It was then that Janet began to understand the power of storytelling, the way a stranger's performance could reach across the distance between fiction and reality to offer comfort to someone who desperately needed it. The nurses noticed it too. Sarah would request Scarlett movies when the pain was particularly bad, when treatments left her too weak for books or conversation. Over the 18 months of treatment, Scarlett's films became Sarah's companion. When the pain was too much to concentrate on books, when visitors were too exhausting, when the future felt too uncertain to discuss, Sarah would ask for one of Scarlett's movies. Janet learned to read her daughter's moods through her movie choices, the action films when Sarah was feeling fighters, the romantic comedies when she needed hope, the dramas when she was ready to confront her own mortality. Near the end, when the doctors had exhausted all treatment options and conversations turned to comfort care rather than cure, Sarah had made a list. Not a bucket list. She was too practical for that kind of thinking, but a list of things she wanted to accomplish in whatever time she had left. The list was simple. Tell Dad I'm proud of him for going back to school. Help Mom learn to cook something other than frozen dinners. Donate my books to the children's hospital. Write letters to the teachers who made a difference. And finally, in her careful 16-year-old handwriting, tell Scarlett Johansson her movies made my chemo bearable. Sarah had written the letter on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 2 weeks before she died. Janet had found it on her daughter's nightstand along with a note asking her mother to find a way to deliver it. The letter was sealed in an envelope addressed simply to Scarlett Johansson, Hollywood, CA. The kind of addressing that only a teenager would think sufficient. Janet had kept the letter for 2 years, carrying it in her purse like a talisman. She'd researched Scarlett's management companies, her publicists, her official fan mail addresses. She'd written cover letters explaining the situation, had made phone calls that went unreturned, had sent emails that disappeared into the void of celebrity communication systems. Nothing had worked. The letter remained undelivered. And with each passing month, Janet felt like she was failing Sarah in yet another way. She'd kept every other promise on her daughter's list. But this one, the one that seemed to matter most to Sarah, remained unfulfilled. Now, sitting in the Late Show audience and listening to Scarlett talk about motherhood and strength, Janet felt the weight of that letter in her hands. This was closer to Scarlett than she'd ever been, closer than she'd ever imagined being. But what could she do? Stand up and interrupt a television taping? Shout across the studio like some deranged fan? Scarlett was still talking, her voice growing more emotional as she discussed the challenges of raising a daughter in the public eye. "I want Rose to understand that being strong doesn't mean being perfect. It means showing up. Especially when you don't want to, it means being honest about your struggles, about your fears. I hope that if she ever faces something really difficult, she'll remember that her mom tried to show her what resilience looks like." The words hit Janet like a physical blow. Resilience. Showing up when you don't want to. Being honest about your struggles. That was exactly what Sarah had written in her letter, exactly the qualities she'd said Scarlett's characters had taught her. Janet looked around the studio, at the cameras capturing every word, at the audience members sitting in their seats like well-behaved participants in someone else's story. She thought about Sarah, about the promise she'd made, about the letter that had been waiting for 2 years to find its destination, and suddenly she stood up. The movement was so abrupt that the people around her turned to look. Janet's heart was pounding as she realized what she'd done, but she couldn't sit back down. Not now. Not when Sarah's words were so close to finding their target. David noticed the disturbance first. His eyes moved past the cameras to locate the source, and he saw Janet standing in the third row, clutching an envelope, tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am," David said gently, his voice carrying across the studio. "Are you okay?" The audience turned to look at Janet, and suddenly she was visible to everyone. To David, to Scarlett, to the cameras, to the millions of people who would eventually watch this broadcast. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Scarlett had turned in her chair to see what was happening. When their eyes met across the studio, Janet felt something shift. This wasn't a famous person anymore. This was just another mother, another woman who understood what it meant to love someone so much that their pain became your pain. "I have a letter," Janet said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the studio microphones caught every word. "I have a letter for you." David stood up from behind his desk. "Would you like to come down here?" Janet nodded, though her legs felt unsteady as she made her way down the aisle toward the stage. The audience watched in silence, sensing that something unscripted and important was happening. When Janet reached the stage area, David helped her up the steps. Scarlett had risen from her chair and was walking toward them, her expression showing concern and curiosity. "What's your name?" David asked gently. "Janet Morrison," she said, her voice stronger now. "And this letter is from my daughter Sarah. She died 2 years ago. She was 16. The studio fell completely silent. Not the manufactured quiet of a commercial break, but the deep silence that comes when people witness something too real for entertainment. Scarlett stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Janet's face. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "What did Sarah want me to know?" Janet's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on lined notebook paper, the kind teenagers use for school assignments. Sarah's handwriting was careful and neat, though you could see where her hand had trembled slightly from the medication. "She wanted me to read this to you," Janet said, her voice growing stronger with purpose. "She wrote it 2 weeks before she died." She unfolded the letter carefully, and Janet began to read, her voice clear and strong. "Dear Scarlett, you don't know me, but your movie saved my life over and over again, not in the dramatic way that sounds like a movie itself, but in the small, daily way that matters when you're fighting something bigger than yourself. When I was in the hospital getting chemo, when I was too sick to read or talk, I would watch your movies and remember what brave looked like." Janet paused, her voice catching slightly. Scarlett nodded encouragingly, tears already forming. "You probably think acting is just pretending," Janet continued. But for me, watching you pretend to be strong taught me how to actually be strong. When I couldn't find my own courage, I borrowed yours. When I couldn't imagine surviving another treatment, I thought about how your characters never gave up, even when everything seemed hopeless." The studio was absolutely silent. "The thing is," Janet continued, "I know I'm probably not going to make it. The doctors try to sound optimistic, but I can see the truth in their charts. But I'm not scared anymore, because you taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what you have to do even when you are afraid." The letter went on for another paragraph, thanking Scarlett for specific performances, for moments in films that had given Sarah strength during her darkest hours. When Janet finished reading, the silence in the studio was profound. Scarlett was crying openly now. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the letter. Janet handed it to her, and Scarlett read it again silently, taking in every word that Sarah had written. When she looked up, her voice was thick with emotion. "Janet, your daughter was braver than any character I've ever played, and so are you. Being here tonight, sharing her words, that takes incredible courage." David stepped forward. "Janet, what would Sarah want us to know about her?" "She was funny," Janet said, smiling through her tears. "She was so funny. Even during treatment, she would make jokes about losing her hair, about the hospital food, about how all the nurses were in love with her oncologist. She said laughter was just another way of being brave." Scarlett folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Janet. "Would you mind if I kept a copy of this? I'd like to remember Sarah's words." "She would like that," Janet said. "She always said you got it. You understood what strength really meant." David looked at both women, then at the audience, then directly into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break. But before we do, I want you to remember something. Sometimes the most important work we do as human beings happens when we're not even aware we're doing it." Sarah Morrison never met Scarlett Johansson, but Scarlett's work gave Sarah strength when she needed it most. And tonight, Sarah's courage is giving all of us something to think about. The cameras cut to commercial, but nobody moved. Janet and Scarlett stood together on the stage, two mothers connected by loss, by love, by the understanding that sometimes the most profound gifts are the ones we give without knowing. "Thank you," Scarlett whispered to Janet. "Thank you for making sure I knew." "Thank you," Janet replied, for giving her something to hold on to. In that moment, surrounded by the machinery of television and the business of entertainment, something timeless and sacred had occurred. A daughter's love had found its destination, carried by a mother's devotion across the distance between grief and grace.